Welcome to Filmwax Radio, Ira Sachs.
Thank you, Adam.
It's been great. I've been wanting to invite you on for a long time.
Well, it's nice to have a chance to talk about this film and other films.
Yeah. It makes the most sense that it would be now, since your film is about to come out. How does that feel? Certainly had a lot of screenings of it, many.
Yeah.
But
no, it's exciting to actually have the film open in New York and to sort of in LA and around the country. It's a long, I think what people don't know who aren't in this business is that, in a way, distributing a film for a filmmaker is not that different than being in production. It's you're really focused on the work that you need to do to get these things out, and so that's where my head is what do I do next to promote, to talk, and to get the film seen, really.
Well, you're natural at it. I mean, as far as I can tell. But how is that transition? And then we'll talk about the film, of course. But how is it now putting on this hat of
I think
ambassador?
I started making films 20 plus years ago, and I think the biggest thing I learned in those 2 decades is that as a director, you are actually the producer of the film, whether you call yourself so or not. Since the end of the studio system and the beginning of the independent film movement, the idea that there's going to be a parent figure who takes control and sort of moves you into the realm of possibility is no longer the structure. So I'm always parenting my film. Now I'm actually parenting. Also, I had twins 2 months ago. So
oh my God!
I'm using those skills in
several
several realms.
Can you divulge their names?
Viva and Felix.
Viva and Felix. So
The
life and
fabulous
happiness.
Exactly, life and happiness.
That's great.
Of which they both are.
Yeah. I'm just speaking of the daddies of all, like daddy figures. Robert Altman.
I worked for Robert Altman for 3 days.
3 days.
Yes.
What was
I
your
cleaned
role?
out his warehouse.
It's an honor, Mr. Altman.
It was, and I
I hope, by the way, that is a literal expression, because it
cleaned out his warehouse.
I don't know what else it could mean. But
I will admit now that I stole a poster of 3 women that I have on my office wall. But there were many. There was a stack. It was a big stack. So.
Oh no! And even if it was like signed, monographed by Sissy Spacek, Shelley Duvall, and
Janice Rule.
Janice Rule,
the mother of Liz Gazzara.
Very good. Yeah. So even if it was signed, I would still not. No one could possibly blame you if there was sitting out. The temptation would be just so great, right?
But I have to. We were sort of chatting about Altman, but I have to say, when I started working on Keep the Lights On, I had in my mind the need to channel these independent filmmakers of that generation, independent filmmakers who were working, Cassavetes, even in a way even more, because they were making films at a time where independent wasn't a genre, it was actually a mode of production. And I think for me, with Keep the Lights On, which I had a sense was going to be a very liberated film, that it would somehow need to be made in a different kind of way. And I think that's really how it's happened.
Yeah, because it does feel like with Married Life, which was your last feature, that it would, it seemed almost that you were going in a more possibly commercial direction. That's only because there were named stars in it.
Yeah.
And but that means nothing. But you could have certainly gone in that direction. But.
Well, I think Married Life. I originated the film. I wrote the script while at McDowell. There's a scene in Keep the Lights On based on my time at McDowell at the artist residency in New Hampshire. It was a very personal film ultimately, and in a way, the themes of the film are not so different than Keep the Lights On. I will say that at some point in my early 40s, which was about 5 years ago, I began to understand that in some way my position, my potential as a filmmaker was much more based on my ability to make things differently than the mainstream, than anywhere close. Like that I, as a subcultural figure, as someone from New York who was in a way as inspired by people like Jack Smith and David Wojnarowicz as I have been by Altman and Cassavetes, that to consider myself in some levels an experimenter, someone outside, was where I might actually find more traction, I guess is the word.
Sure. And would you intentionally try to keep yourself on the outside? Is that a
I think I never start a project until I have a sense that something about it, which includes everything about it, will be accessible and desired by an audience. I wouldn't want to make a film that I didn't think people would want to see. So I've always in a way considering commercial elements, because I'm not a poet. I'm a filmmaker, and it's a public medium. So I think that I'm always trying to figure out a story that will resonate on all sorts of levels.
Mm-hmm. And what would define to you what is commercial, if you can?
Well, I use the word economic more than commercial in a certain way. I mean, I think commercial is I guess, is a worse term in some ways. To me, commercial means watered down. It means to appeal to the most sort of quadrants. It means, and I think that's actually, I feel there's a lot of discussion about how television is the new auteur medium, and I think you have to also take into account what are the considerations that an artist has to make to work in television. One always has to make considerations. They did in the studio system. They do now in an art film. You're always making considerations. But I think television has a certain set that are very different than the history, for example, of the art film, which I'm still invested in.
Mm-hmm. I asked about that, what your definition was, because the theme of to keep the lights on is universal. I mean, anyone who would hopefully choose to see the film would be able to relate to it. The experience of falling in love and then wanting to keep a relationship going despite all of the signs and all your friends and loved ones' advice, etc. Anyone who's thrown themselves into something emotionally can relate to that. It certainly sort of surpasses any specific thing like gay cinema or I don't know any other categories one might want to put this in.
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm a filmmaker, and that means that I'm a storyteller. And I think for me, I'm always trying to get the details right of the characters, what I consider their anthropology, their sociology, their psychology. I'm trying to get all those details correct, but if I do so with enough precision, then I have faith that the film will be resonant to anyone who sees it. I mean, I think, I made a film about a Russian woman living in Memphis with a rock and roll legend. Well, I didn't make that for Russian women particularly, but I did try to get all the details right of that woman as I could imagine her and as she was portrayed by Dina Korzun as she lived. But it's, I'm a big Henry James fan, but you can't say that we are at this point like living a life that looks like Henry James, and yet we relate to it as individuals, and we find our own stories in those novels, classic novels. And I hope in some levels that if I do the film right, it is specifically about a certain point in history and a certain set of characters and a certain community. But that is just the kind of tableau in which the story of these individuals is told. You
get a sense of place so strongly in your films. You linger on the moments, the people, the peripheral. Those textures really come to life in your films. And through there you can see back through the maybe Cassavetes or Altman or probably many European filmmakers who have had an influence on you. I mean, I think for me the most important element of being a director is curiosity and an interest in how people live. I think, the only other job I might have been suited for would be a therapist or an analyst, really, because I think that the other element that's important is to have some ability to sort of passively analyze the ways in which people behave, and to have an understanding of behavior without trying to dictate too strongly how things should be interpreted. And I think that's actually a position that the psychoanalyst also sits in. Yeah, well, I'm sure at times you must wear that hat on the set. But I don't think you're maybe implying that that's in terms of actors and trying to. And I think it's actually crew. And I think it's yeah. I mean, I think that basically as a director, you're not so dissimilar to an actor. I think what the job of an actor is to listen and respond. Mm-hmm. So, for example, and I think that's actually what a director also does. So I'm doing that right here. I'm listening and I'm trying to respond as authentically as possible to the questions that are being asked of me. And I think that's really what directing is about, is a series of answering questions and making decisions. With my actors, I tend not to rehearse. I don't rehearse with them before we start shooting. Interesting, yeah. And I have found, it was actually Sidney Pollack, who was the executive producer on 40 Shades of Blue, who gave me permission really to do that, because he told me that he never rehearsed his actors. And I'd come from the theater world
and had been a theater director initially, and theater directors like to hear themselves talk. Like, it's a really big part of the process. It's also part of the rehearsal process. In film, in a way, what I try to do is get out of the way. I don't want to hear myself, and I don't want the actors to be thinking about my words when they are with each other in a moment that we're shooting.
It's interesting that you don't rehearse. Not that I think that's more effective or less effective. It's just coming from the theater that one would think you'd be more inclined to rehearse the actors. And also, I would imagine, though, the upside of coming from the theater is that how could you not be an actor's director? You would not relate. How would you not relate well to actors? And
yeah, I mean, I think I have a sense. I worked with Chris Cooper on Married Life, and there was a couple of scenes where he's acting only by himself. So there was a lot of blocking, because we really often when there's two actors, the blocking is kind of loose because you don't know where they're going to go, and you let them go in their own direction. When there's just one actor, it seems that it tends to need more blocking. And working with Chris, which was a very rich experience for me, was the first time in many years that I thought, I miss directing for the theater, because there is something really satisfying about the exchange of ideas and language between myself and an actor, and in this case a great actor like Chris Cooper. But because I'm interested in acting, I've learned that there's something very different. In theater, people need to learn how to repeat themselves. In film, they need to learn how to be in the moment as if it was the first time. And I found the best way to do that is make it the first time.
It will feel very spontaneous. Once they are used to that, feeling spontaneous,
Well, really what happens is they're not playing subtext. All I'm asking for them to do is listen.
Yeah.
And I'm actually asking them I will direct the film as much by editing it as anything else. They don't need to edit the film. They don't need to think about what the future of the character is. All they have to do is listen and respond. Then what happens is that what you're doing, I think of every fiction film as a form of documentary. Really what you're doing is capturing something that happens in a moment, and you're trying to build a world that is as rich as possible. So as a photographer, you're there to observe in a certain way. And then as a storyteller, you're creating the kind of trajectory of those points of action. In this film, those points are made up of really a series of dramatic events that happen in the course of a 10-year history.
Paul's a grown-up. He's going to work it out or he's not, but you're not going to save him. You never were and you aren't now.
Hands together. He said that I had ruined his life and that he wasn't going to stay.
We're not having sex.
No!
Sometimes love takes the long way.
I'll come home tomorrow. You should leave now.
I'm not leaving.
The film began out of journals and diaries, and in a way you can see that kind of structure when you watch the film, because it has these moments of ellipses, spaces between events, which I think in a way mimic the spaces between when you decide to write in your diary.
Right, that's very true. What makes you ready to sit down and face yourself? What, these moments where you're more prepared to do that? Dig in a little deeper.
I think that for me, I start a film generally when I can see a story, and in this case, I ended a relationship in 2008, and I had a sense that 10 years before I had began on a very particular day the same relationship, and then somehow between those 2 points was a good story. But also,
as you've said, there's a clear beginning and end.
There's a clear beginning and
Like
end. There's a first
movie.
day and there's a last day. It's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
I needed actually permission in a certain way to tell this story, and I got that from Mauricio Zacharias, who was my co-writer, and we were working on another project for a few months, and then sort of right before we started writing the first draft of the film, I handed him scenes that I'd written for Keep the Lights On, and also hundreds of pages of journals. And I sort of said, just read this. And he was the one who came back to me and said, this is clearly the film that we need to make.
Yeah.
But I needed, in a way, someone to give me the permission to consider my story interesting enough to create a fictional film about it.
Yeah. Did you feel that way because you wanted to avoid the idea of narcissism on some level, or was that it, or was it just
maybe on some level I wasn't clear yet how clear the story was, and I needed this collaborator to
Yes.
tell me that the story was there and that it was relevant to him as a reader.
Yeah. Well, how could you be? Yeah. How could you be objective?
Yeah,
in that
I
moment,
mean,
when considering such a thing, such
Yeah.
a project.
it took time, and I think it also really what happened was that it took time for me to get to the point that I had the distance I needed from the experience to be a good filmmaker. I think if you don't have distance, then you actually are there's nothing confessional about this movie. It's actually it's reportage, and it's also storytelling, and I think I needed to be outside a little bit in order to do that.
Yeah. And I understand your respect for the actors. There's Thure Lindhardt and
And Zachary Booth.
I noticed it's one of these odd coincidences when I was going back and watching the earlier films, because I had just watched this Danish film like 2 weeks ago. It's not a new one. It's called Open Hearts.
Love Open Hearts.
Yeah.
An obscenely intimate movie.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It takes this very kind of old, sort of storyline. I mean,
Yeah.
which we've seen so many
Yeah.
times,
Yeah.
yet manages somehow to make
It could have been Barbara Stanwyck or Joan Crawford in that
right.
dead, right?
Exactly. But you've used the actress
Paprika.
and I know
Steen.
I've heard you speak about her, but I was like, wait a minute, and I quickly had to say that can't be the same actress. What would she be doing in this film, 50 Shades of Blue? And she was in Keep the Lights On
Yeah,
too,
she
correct?
is. She is.
So it was remarkable. She
Well,
played, I guess, Eric's sister.
She plays
isn't it?
Eric's sister, and it wasn't the initial. Once I'd cast a Danish actor, I knew when I finished the script that there would likely be some problem casting an American actor in the film based on the material and based on the sex in the material, and also a certain kind of nakedness to the to the story, both emotionally and physically. And I sent the film to an agent that I often send my work to. He usually comes back with a list of people I should consider for a part, and he came back to me with the words that no one in his agency would be available for this part. And when I heard that,
I see.
he said, "It's a great film. I'm excited that you're making it. It's the perfect film for you to make, but no one here is going to do that." and at that point, I had a sense. I've often been interested and worked with European actors. There's both because I think that there is I think mostly because I like the style of acting that you find in Europe. It's not coincidental. I like Dogma. I think there's something about, I love French contemporary cinema. It's been very important to me. I'm very involved in it in my own head creatively. There's a certain kind of nuanced, detailed naturalism that is sort of more the type of acting you find in Europe that I'm drawn to. I love American acting too, but the great American actors are like Elizabeth Taylor. They're larger than
Rip
life.
Torn.
Rip Torn.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to find people who can sort of blend into the world that I'm portraying, and Thure was described to me as someone said he was the bravest actor in Denmark and also one of the best, and that I should meet him, and I did, and I was very lucky.
Indeed. And as far as that role goes, it's as far as going through such heart-wrenching pain that he went through standing by Paul and watching him suffer and trying to be there and putting himself through such pain himself. No one could do that better than a Scandinavian because, of course, they invented that.
They did.
Yeah.
They were the first to suffer.
Yeah, exactly. They invented suffering. I think suffering might be a Swedish word, but
yeah, exactly.
But Danes have sort of made it into obviously an art form here.
Well, I sort of think that's you're joking, but on some level there is Thure was like a completely open to what's exciting about the performance is it's a film about a person who has a hard time making a decision, which is another classic Danish part. He just played Hamlet, by the way, when we cast it.
Is that true?
Yeah.
That's
but
beautiful.
I think that within that he's like super energetic. There's something about him that is incredibly watchable, and that's what I think brings the film to life. You mentioned earlier that the film couldn't be defined as any sort of type of film or a gay film or something like that. And I think, I was just thinking about that, and I think what's been most rewarding about the project for me is that if I talk to almost anyone after a screening of the film, they tend to tell me something about their own relationships, and they talk to me about their divorces or their struggles or their questions about monogamy or their questions about, what is love and should they stay in this relationship? You start getting into things, and I think that the film works as a template in a certain way, as a place for people to find versions of their own dynamics, because there's something though the details are quite, dramatic in a certain way. The construction of this relationship, I think, mirrors probably half the relationships in the world. I feel like half people are signed on to relationships that maybe shouldn't exist, but they hold on to them with dear life, and
They do. They fight tooth and nail, not even being able to often articulate or identify why.
I've come to the reason is people don't like themselves on some level. That this is a film, in a way, like all my films, about some process of self-discovery.
I thought you were going to say self-destruction.
I think it's about self-destruction, which leads to self-discovery. That would certainly be the story of 40 Shades of Blue. Mm-hmm. There's a scene in the woods towards the end of that movie where the character of Laura, the Russian woman, kind of allows herself to be, in a way, violated by a man, and it's sort of it's her bottom. I think all my films have bottoms, and then hopefully they have, the phoenix rising.
Yeah, the climb up or back up.
And I would say that's something I relate to personally. I feel like the events of this film do depict, in a certain way, at the end of the relationship that I was in, my life exploded. And when I was able to put the pieces back together and start the next chapter of my life, I did it very differently. And in a lot of ways, I would say Keep the Lights On is the result of that period. Keep the Lights On as a title refers to the idea and really the call to arms for people to live a transparent life. And then on some ways, this is a story about two people who were destroyed by their secrets. And I think those were secrets that they established before they met each other. I don't think the relationship destroyed them. I think it was the trajectory of their lives that they needed to go through something, which ultimately I think has really changed them. And I think for me as a filmmaker, you could see the similarities between this film and my previous work. But in a way, I think this is my freest film.
I would agree with that, yeah. I encourage everyone listening to go see it, and we will not describe how the relationship, where they embark at the end, let's put it that way. It's worth exploring, seeing yourself and experiencing. While we're chatting, I did want to ask you about Last Address.
Oh, okay.
Because I know that's a fairly recent work as well,
Yes.
and it's part of something else that you're obviously very passionate about. And so it's about 10 minutes, let's say, right? And it just shows basically exteriors of homes where artists had been living, their last known address, and had since passed away as a result of some complication due to AIDS.
Correct.
And this is now part of the permanent installment at the Whitney, is that right?
Permanent collection.
Excuse me.
Collection at the Whitney, and also at MoMA has purchased it. And it's actually been my most seen film.
As a result?
No, I think something about the film really touched a nerve, and it became.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also there's so little memory of the loss of that this city and our culture experienced in terms of AIDS. There's no AIDS memorial. In a way, the film works as a virtual AIDS memorial. Mm-hmm. It's we created a website, lastaddress.org, which is online, which includes the film, but also includes links to interviews, videos, works, essays about all the artists. And in a way, for me, that was the greatest experience of this film, which was sort of learning again about this group of artists who were in New York in the 70s and 80s, a whole generation who disappeared. And my interest was as someone trying to figure out how to make a life as an artist. I have had so few mentors. I've had so few examples. And one of the reasons was because of this disappearance.
Right.
But that work is still there to teach me. And I think Keep the Lights On came out of that work in a lot of ways, because I think I started exposing myself to David Vodorovich and Keith Haring and Arthur Russell and Cookie Mueller and these great long Mapplethorpe,
sure,
any long number of people number who were living in New York at a time in which creating art wasn't necessarily the road to riches. It was a form of expression, and there was a need to say things,
Right.
and there was a lack of fear, because the stakes weren't just about how do I assimilate.
And there was a community, I assume. I mean,
There was a community. I don't think this group was necessarily one community, but there was. I came to New York in '84, and I was loosely part of a world that was. I was part of ACT UP in '88, and I think that energy is one that kind of, on no level am I punk, but I hope that my films sort of draw upon a punk aesthetic, which is to say this is how we live and not be frightened.
thank you very much for coming on to Filmwax Radio on bboxradio.com, and good luck with Keep the Lights On.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.